Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Mexico's new government has promised far-reaching changes in the economic model, changes in the security model, and an end to corruption and impunity, which have been at the root of many of the problems the country faces. But there's one area where they haven't talked as much about change, and yet it's fundamental to making changes in all the other areas, and that's the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Mexico has traditionally been very dependent on the United States, and it's played a preponderant role in what happens here in Mexico. Today we're going to be talking about that, and we're very happy to have here in the studio Ted Lewis. Ted, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Laura.
Ted is the director of the Mexico Program for Global Exchange, located in San Francisco, California, and he's worked in Mexico on issues of human rights for decades. Ted, based on your experience and what we've seen in the relationship, especially in the last administrations, what do you think is the most important part of that relationship that has to change if the López Obrador government is to carry out many of the other types of transformations that are included in its program?
I mean, it's such a complex relationship between the United States and Mexico, but I think the one area that has to change that's fundamental is the security relationship and the imposition by the United States of a security model on Mexico and the rest of the hemisphere for that matter, but it's very much affected Mexico's options in regards to violence, the drug war, as well as human rights questions in general. The United States has never really been a promoter of human rights anywhere in the world. There's a lot of talk about human rights. There's even funding for human rights initiatives. But when push comes to shove, the United States has always been more concerned with the military and military relationships, security relationships, and that's very much been the case in Mexico. So I think unless and until that changes profoundly, the options that Mexico has are going to be quite limited.
Okay, so you're saying that the imposition from the United States of a certain security model is a factor that's had a hugely negative impact on human rights here. Could you characterize that security model for us in rough terms?
Well, it's a security model that from the point of view of the United States, sees Mexico as a tool for the United States, both to block migrants at the southern frontier. That's a more recent part of it, but a very, very important part, as well as to impose a model of the drug war on Mexico, which is one that's about attacking the supply, not really dealing with consumption and all the things that happen in the United States, and not dealing with the money laundering and the many other aspects that keep the war going, and just aiming at trying to take out the top leaders of the cartels that the DEA fingers and then go after them. And we know that this has had disastrous consequences over a period now of well, ever since 2006. Before that, it wasn't good, but since 2006, the model has accelerated. The amount of deaths has just risen almost every year. There have been occasional drop-offs, but that model has left Mexico in a terrible situation and has made Mexico's military, and this is something that started back in the Clinton administration, has made Mexico's military more dominant in the security picture than any of the other forces. So this is a model that appears to be one that at least initially López Obrador doesn't see a way out of, because he has opted for a model that replicates a lot of what we've seen over the years. I don't know what his relationship is going to look like with the United States, and that's a big open question.
Well, on this, when you talk about this model, then it's a fight fire with fire model. It's been called that. And there's
Yes.
there's a pretty broad consensus here in Mexico that it hasn't worked for what it was supposed to work. And in fact, it's been counterproductive. And it was really one of the reasons that experts attribute to the victory of López Obrador, that he would change that model. Now, if that's the model, what are the mechanisms? Why do you say that this is imposed from the United States? If there's a consensus against the model, but it seems to be less clear, among many people anyway, the degree to which the United States is responsible for that model.
Well, I think the United States has tremendous responsibility for that model, and has been pushing that within the United States since the Nixon administration. I think the consensus, a war on drugs, a war on supply, a war on the people who use drugs. This has been the way that it's been approached. It's been seen as a moral failure to use drugs, and any methods to eliminate the scourge are okay. And it's unfortunate, from the point of view of the Pentagon, that so many people have to die, but they're not really measuring. I mean, we know, and I think the consensus is growing in the United States as well, that a public health approach to drug use is the only one that has really been shown scientifically to be effective. It's the only way that people give up and are helped out of problematic drug use. That's the way we've got to go. But that's not what we're hearing talked about here, and it's certainly not the model that the United States has exported, not just to Mexico, but around the world. It's been more intense in Mexico because Mexico's a neighbor country. There's 2,000 miles of border. All the elements that make the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico so intense and so complex, but they really come to bear on this issue in a way that has been absolutely disastrous for Mexico. And indeed, it was one of the reasons that López Obrador got elected, because he made it clear that he didn't agree with the model and was going to change it. So there's tremendous expectation. There's going to be a lot of pressure, to see results. The choices he's made thus far in terms of opting for maintaining a military approach. There's some of people close to López Obrador, supporters who believe that he's moving in a direction that will eventually lead to demilitarization, and I certainly hope that they're right. But right now, there's grave concern that this isn't working, and I don't see any counterweight to that in the United States. There's been a big change in the United States in terms of how
Drug
people in the United
policy.
States are seeing drug policy. But from the federal level, and certainly from the Trump administration, we see no hint that there's going to be any change.
Well, if experts and historical experience tells us that this model of supply-side attacks and a criminalization and model for dealing with organized crime based on drug trafficking has not worked, why does the United States insist, and particularly here in Mexico, in continue it? Are there specific interests that are involved behind this? And if that's the case, and this would be the follow-up question, is López Obrador constrained in the degree to which he can actually change that, given the weight of the U.S. relationship?
Yeah, well, the amount of weapons and whatnot the United States sells and uses in the drug war is significant, but I don't think that's the driving factor. I think there's an ideological factor that's very strong, and if you recall, back when the United States was withdrawing from the Cold War, when the Cold War was ending, and the United States no longer had a pretext for its vast military expenditures and its vast deployment of troops around the world, the drug war suddenly became much more central to the discourse of U.S. policy. So I think it's U.S. Foreign policy, U.S. military policy,
So it's
and a
the latest
justification
version,
for maintaining the biggest military in the world. That's much larger than any other country. I think the top 4 other countries combined, barely match the U.S. Military budget. So the U.S. has a tremendously dominant military, and it has been one of the ways that the United States has also been able to dominate Mexico by pushing its policies on Mexico. It has transformed the way Mexico's armed forces have worked. Back in the day, Mexico's armed forces had the mission of defending Mexico from the most obvious enemy, which was the United States, because the United States had invaded Mexico, taken half its national territory, and so this was something that was an obvious, element for Mexico to defend itself and to defend its dignity, its rights, and all that. At this point, the Mexican military and the U.S. military, it's very hard to tell where one starts and the other stops, because there's been so much integration. There's been training in the School of the Americas. There's been all of the pieces that make Mexico's commanders looking northward for their clues rather than looking to the national model. I hope that there's some counterweight to that with the new government, and that we'll see a big shift there. I haven't seen the evidence yet that it's going to happen. But
well, a lot of people herald this shared responsibility and this degree of integration and cooperation as a step forward in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, just because there's a higher level of cooperation. But what you're saying is that there's some real pitfalls and dangers in the two of them cooperating on a model that has such detrimental effects on the people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think there's plenty of room for cooperation on all kinds of matters, cross-border matters, and security matters might be one of them. But I don't really see the integration being one that has that's balanced. It's a U.S. model. It's imposed on Mexico. And Mexico has not been able to break away from that. Felipe Calderon, was in a certain sense paying, a debt to the United States for supporting him in the 2006 election by taking the U.S. model in an even more aggressive fashion, and using that as a way to build public support for himself. This is not something that that can continue if Mexico wants to find a way out of the incredible violence that's just ripping up communities, particularly in the north of the country. But that one can find examples of this kind of just devastating destruction of human life and human community all over the country. And as being in the human rights field, we have gone to these places, talked to people, felt the desperation that people have, and understand why a proposal to change that model was so popular electorally speaking, and why that was such an important part of what got Andrés Manuel elected. Another big part of him getting elected was the fact that people perceived, rightly or wrongly, that he was someone who was going to stand up to Donald Trump, who is seen both in the United States by people like myself and around the world as a very dangerous ultra-right figure who is changing the atmosphere in our country, in the United States, and creating conflict wherever he can to build up his own interests. So those factors are two big ones that got Andrés Manuel into power, and he's going to need to make good on them if he's going to maintain his popularity and maintain the kind of social support that he needs to do the kinds of transformation that are so important and that Mexico needs so badly.
Well, it's certainly a fine line, because on the one hand, there's the need to comply with these promises and to make those transformations that you've mentioned, and of course that have been at the core of the campaign and the promises of the new government. And then there's the fact that the United States can do quite a bit of damage in Mexico. I mean, there's an economic dependency. There's a question of how international markets react. How do you think that he could walk that fine line? I'm not asking you to answer this very difficult question, but from your point of view in human rights and working with communities that are resisting Trump in the United States, what are some of the ways that could be built up perhaps binationally to confront Trump without creating huge vulnerabilities?
Yeah, well, keeping Donald Trump calm and out of attack mode has clearly been the strategy of Andrés Manuel. He has, been very, he has lauded Donald Trump in certain ways. In the letter, the famous letter that he wrote,
The bromance letter.
Yes, kind of made a bromance. He kind of made common cause with Donald Trump, and has been extremely successful thus far in keeping Donald Trump from attacking him, and for the most part from attacking Mexico. There have been the threats to close the frontier, and those kinds of things have come out in the tweets. And for those of us who've watched Donald Trump and what's happening in the United States, I don't think that the bromance or the honeymoon between these two leaders can last very long. That said, I do think that that Andrés Manuel is moving in a way thus far which has not directly challenged Trump. For example, approving of the entire renegotiation of the free trade agreement and basically taking it on as this is a given, it's already been signed, we're going to live with it, we're going to support this. This is clearly a way to keep Donald Trump off his case and off Mexico's case. So I don't know if those kind of, there's not a lot of opportunities like that one. I don't know how Mexico can truly defend its dignity. And that's one thing that I really see Andrés Manuel López Obrador being committed to, is defending the dignity of this country. If he does that in really substantive ways, he will draw the attack of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump doesn't put up with that. And defending the dignity of Mexico includes defending the dignity of migrants, both the ones from Central America that have been so much in the news that Donald Trump has used politically already in very, very serious ways, but also Mexican citizens and people from Mexico who have moved by the millions to the United States over recent decades.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the obvious flashpoint in which it seems almost inevitable that there will be a redefinition at the best, and we don't know how confrontational is immigration. What kind of changes do you think, well, let's just ask, what kind of changes do you think there should be in immigration? Because no one has a crystal ball to know what will happen, and we're also dealing with a very erratic president who is Donald Trump.
Well, one of the things that we've pushed for years, and that you and I have worked on, is the promoting the idea of the right to stay home. That has now become the slogan of the new government here, and I think that is a very powerful counterweight, and has a discourse around it that will help to blunt the attacks from the United States. So I think that's extremely important, that Mexico is taking responsibility for the kind of economic development that gives its citizens the right to stay home. So I think
it really challenges that Trump vision, because when he talks about an invasion, he never talks about forced migration. Never.
Yeah. He never talks about what the United States has done in Honduras to create the kind of chaos and repression that is causing people to leave. He doesn't take responsibility for any of that. But I think from the point of view of the U.S. public, what Mexico is planning to do and trying to do and committing enormous amounts of resources to doing will have a very important effect. The reality of Mexican migration to the United States at this point is that there's a net zero. There's really not a lot of migration in the United States. It's not like in the early period of NAFTA, when you had as many as 500,000 people a year crossing the border undocumented into the United States. That there's nothing like that going on now. So
and then even when you add in Central Americans, we're seeing record lows of apprehensions at the border, no?
Exactly right, and some of those people are scared off by the Trump rhetoric, but the main factors, I think, are that there's not the same level of expulsion out of communities in Mexico that there have been, and the kind of reasons that people are migrating now, we hear a lot more of the concerns about violence and extortion and inability to live in their own communities. That's certainly what you're hearing out of the people who gathered together in San Pedro Sula. We know that that's a nightmare of a city for people to live in. So those factors are going to continue, but what the obligation that we have in the United States as activists and people who are trying to resist the Trump policies is to just use common sense and a little bit of compassion to shine a light on the fact that this really isn't the crisis or the problem that it's being described as, that Trump wants us to believe it is. He is very able to use that fear to scare people in the United States who are afraid of a multicultural society, and that's become a big, a trump card for the right wing in the United States, is to make those threats.
Many people have said it's an openly white supremacist agenda. Would you agree with that?
I agree 100% with that. I think that not all the people who are behaving in a white supremacist way or supporting that movement believe themselves to be racist, and I think there's some of them that under other circumstances and with other leadership could move in other directions. But right now we're experiencing a really frightening wave of white supremacy that feels okay about itself. The white supremacist
not afraid to say
ideas
its name.
have existed in the United States underneath the civil rights movement, underneath the Obama administration when we finally had a black president. But people didn't feel free to talk about it. There was a certain moment sometime in the 1970s where it became politically incorrect to say the kind of things that we're now hearing openly spoken.
And for obvious reasons, it should not be part of a democratic discourse.
Well, exactly. The idea of basic respect for human rights and human diversity means you have to accept everyone just as they are, and you can't pull out these antiquated notions of community based on white ethnicity. It's appalling, but that is what we're up against. We're up against what a lot of people, myself included, think is a fascist threat in the United States.
And misogyny has become acceptable among a certain sector
Absolutely,
of the population.
absolutely.
Thanks to Trump too.
Thanks to Trump and thanks to thousands of years of patriarchy, but Trump is certainly using things like the Kavanaugh hearings to up the ante on misogyny and to make it okay again. In his Secretary of Education, one of her main initiatives has been to make it easier for those on campuses, around the college campuses around the United States, to deflect charges of sexual assault. That's been a big initiative. So we see that on all levels. There's an attack on the kinds of changes that we've been so proud to be advancing in the United States. The kind of move toward a multicultural, more diverse, more respectful kind of society. This is all being pushed backwards, and Trump is part of a worldwide movement in this direction toward fascism. And I hope that there's not a similar phenomenon in Mexico. We do know from history that when a left-wing or a radical government of any kind moves in, or even something as milk with toast as the Obama government that represented a kind of change, at least on a certain level, that reaction builds.
There's a backlash.
There's a backlash. So that's something I think Mexico has to watch out for. Well,
that would be 6 years on up the road. Right now, and also it's clearly something that people have to be aware of, because we're seeing it in Brazil now too, and in other countries. But for right now, then, we have this push toward exclusion, toward intolerance in the United States, and we have this government that it's one of the most advanced in terms of gender parity now in both the Congress and in the cabinet in the entire world. with a commitment to women's rights. We don't know how deep it goes yet, you know, and a commitment to indigenous rights as well. So does that make for, you think, an inevitable collision? Or are there ways that they could perhaps just maybe distance themselves a little more?
Well, I think Andrés Manuel is going for a coexistence kind of strategy, and it may work. I mean, he's a very able politician, and he might have the magic formula to keep Trump at bay. I certainly think that's what Mexico needs to hope for, but I also have watched Trump enough to know that if someone is in any significant way opposing what he wants, he attacks. So, you know, we said earlier that it was inevitable. I hope that there's a way that the transformation that's going on here, or that the intention to transform Mexico can happen. I think it has had an important impact already in the United States for people who do watch Mexico, seeing that, oh, elections actually can bring something new to the table. There's a lot of cynicism. A lot of people have opted out in the United States, thinking that there's no possible way to change anything, so they might as well just withdraw from the political engagement entirely. And I think that's shifting, and I think what's going on in Mexico, and I think the kind of intense cross-border relationships, socially and culturally, that we have are making people feel very good about Mexico right now. There's a change in the United States that's palpable about how people view Mexico. I mean, it was all problems, drug war.
Despite the Mexico bashing coming from the top.
Yeah, but despite that, I think people feel a lot better about what Mexico can and might do, and we're hoping for the best.
Well, everyone's hoping for the best, and I think a lot will depend too on how consolidated those changes are in terms of the support that we saw at the polls carrying through as this transformation takes place in Mexico, and the degree to which they can create common cause with the forces against Trump and against the Mexico bashing in particular in the United States. We've come to the end of the program, Ted. Thanks so much for being with us. I hope that you can come back again soon, and we'll see how things are going.
All right, fantastic.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.